Okay, so we are on to section 4, the southern colonies. Sorry, I had to get everything set up. Okay, here are key terms and people. This is the area that we're looking at. So on this map, you can really see the major economic exports in the region. You have the purple, which is tobacco. Red is rice, and indigo, the kind of weird orangey color, is cattle and grain. And then the brown is fur and different kind of animal skins. So the reason why we have the Mason-Dixon line is because there was a boundary dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland. A man named Charles Mason and another one named Jeremiah Dixon were hired to survey this land and settle the dispute. So they have their, if you've ever seen anyone on the side of the road with those weird little like tripod things and they're looking through it, they're doing surveying. The survey for Maryland and Pennsylvania took 4 years to finish, and basically the boundary that they drew, so you can see it right there in the picture, is called the Mason-Dixon line. After the Revolution, after the American Revolution, this was the dividing line between northern states where slavery had been abolished and southern states where it was still legal. So 5 colonies located south of the Mason-Dixon line were Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. They share a coastal area called the Tidewater region. That is a flat lowland area that's pretty swampy. And then towards the interior of the country, so into that kind of borderland area, that is what's called the Piedmont. The climate in this region, I think we all know that the climate is hot and humid. The hot summers have a long growing season. So hold on, let me make sure. Oh, here we go. Sorry. I should have gone on to the next slide. So the climate allows for a longer growing season. And the crops that develop here are very labor intensive. Because of that, this allows slavery to get a foothold and really become just necessary in order to make money in this region. Because of this, we will, obviously run into a huge problem later on down the road, but it's that labor intensive crop that people find is uniquely suited to this region that causes slavery to become pervasive throughout the region. So Virginia, I think we saw this. Yeah, we already saw this once before. The reason why the population of Virginia took so long to really get going is because of disease, and it was pretty difficult living conditions. However, by around 1650, the death rate has fallen and the population ends up increasing more quickly. By about 1640, you have around 10,000 settlers in Virginia, and by 1670, the number has reached 40,000. The makeup of the demographics in Virginia change. So the people who make up the population are different. So by the 1670s, there were more children because fewer were dying young. Women are also increasing. So that's kind of one of the key things in making your population grow is you have to have the women who actually give birth, and you have to have the children actually live. Yes. So our native population does not care, does not like the fact that our white population is expanding. The Native American population actually contracts at this time because disease and then fighting is just really decimating their numbers. In 1607, there had been about 8,000 Native Americans there, and by 1675, only about 2,000 were left. Farmers began to take over more and more land to plant tobacco, and obviously the Native Americans did not like that. There were two huge violent confrontations, one in 1622 and the other in 1644. Um, I'm not going to require you know much about them, just know that they happened. Native Americans did kill the colonists, but they were eventually defeated both times. And after 1644, the Native Americans on the coastline just kind of accepted Virginia's rule. Yes, Bacon. Okay, so Bacon's rebellion is kind of it's like a huge family conflict that ends up burning down the city of Jamestown. So in the 1660s, rich Virginia tobacco planters have bought up the good farmland towards the coast of Virginia. So if you have your poorer colonists who want to start their own farms, they can't, or they have to go further to the interior to do that. So they have to actually go to land that's not quite as good, and it's more dangerous to live there because the more inland you get, the more conflict you would have with Native Americans, and you just don't have that support that a town offers. A lot of these young men that were attempting to get land, you had to be a landowner to vote. So it was almost as if the rich people were taking away the opportunity. And, that's kind of the whole point of America, is that the opportunity exists. A lot of poor colonists moved inland, which, like I said, it leads to conflict between Native Americans and the farmers. And the situation that we have right now is Nathaniel Bacon is one of these frontier settlers. He goes to the governor, who was, I can't remember, it was like his cousin or something. It was some kind of relation, and Nathaniel Bacon was like the trashy relative that nobody wants to talk about. So Bacon goes to the governor, and he's like, look, we are, there's a bunch of people, we're out here on the frontier, and we're trying to get these farms established, and we need someone to protect us. These natives keep coming, and they'll just slaughter all of us, and we can't do anything about it. So please send, some people to fight and get rid of these Native Americans that are attacking us. But the governor, he's like, I'm not going to let my trashy relative order me around. But also, they kind of had some trade contacts with these natives. And so he's going, I don't really want to, make those natives mad because they're helping me get rich. So we'll just not do that. Nathaniel becomes the leader of the frontier settlers, and he kind of goes vigilante. He's like, look, if the government is not going to help, then I guess we're just going to have to do it, all on our own. In 1675, he gets 1,000 of these people that are living in that frontier region, and they just start attacking and killing natives. The governor finds this out, and so he declares Bacon and, the guys fighting with Bacon as rebels. Well, Bacon says, okay, if you really want us to be rebels, we'll be rebels. And so he and his people attack the city of Jamestown and burn it to the ground. The governor had to flee. It was like the nighttime, and he was in his night clothes, and he had to run out of Jamestown so that he wouldn't die of being caught on fire. It was very embarrassing for him. Bacon's rebellion eventually fizzles out because Bacon gets sick and he dies. The governor does hang 23 of the men who were with Bacon, but the governor can't kill every single person who is going onto these lands that are thought of as Native American lands. So he kind of has to accept that this is something that is going to happen, and he has to adjust to it. All right, so in Maryland, King Charles I, so this is the one that got his head cut off. Well, this is way back before he got his head cut off. He gives a charter for a new colony to George Calvert, who was a Catholic. Um, Catholics were discriminated against in England. This goes all the way back to Henry VIII. Calvert wants to set up a colony where Catholics can live safely. He sets up the colony of Maryland, and it is across the Chesapeake Bay from Virginia. The first settlers to Maryland were both Catholic and Protestant. They grew tobacco, they fished in the Chesapeake Bay, I think it's crabbing. I think that's like crab fishing. They did that. When George Calvert dies, his son Cecil Calvert, who had the title of Lord Baltimore, he gets the Assembly, not Massachusetts, the Maryland Assembly, to vote on the Act of Toleration of 1649. So in the charter, the Representative Assembly had to be elected, just like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. It was a representative form of government. And when Lord Baltimore went before this lawmaking body, he got them to pass an Act of Toleration in 1649. This Act of Toleration welcomed all Christians and gave adult male Christians the right to vote and hold office. It did not protect non-Christians, but this was still a very early example of how, America is going to evolve differently than any of the European countries. And he did this because there were more Protestants actually moving into Maryland than there were Catholics. And so he was afraid that the same thing that happened in England was then just going to turn around and happen to this colony that was founded to give Catholics like a safe haven. All right, so if we're moving south, we are looking at, south of Virginia. It's just natural for people to, if there is not enough land in the north, for them to go, well, maybe there's some in the south. And so they just continue to move south. In 1663, King Charles II, so that was the guy who got his head cut off, that's his son, he gives a charter for a new colony to be established. And it's an area called Carolina. Carolina is the feminine form of Charles. The northern part of this region, it developed very slowly. It doesn't have many rivers. It doesn't have many natural harbors for ships. And at this time, it's much easier and cheaper to ship by sea and water than it is over land. There are settlers with small farms. They, kind of raise and export tobacco and a little bit of lumber. But it's not the same as the area to the south. The southern part grows very quickly. The sugarcane grows very well in the swampy areas towards the coastline. You have planters that are coming up from the Caribbean to bring enslaved people to grow sugar. And once, slavery becomes accepted in the area, these enslaved people were also used to grow rice. Rice ends up becoming South Carolina's most important crop. The area that's known as South Carolina now, when it was still Carolina, the biggest city there was called Charlestown. Now we call it Charleston. See, we're always very, very creative naming things. By the time Charlestown gains, I guess, a foothold and actually becomes established, that is when we finally, we split North Carolina and South Carolina. It's all because of economic reasons, but it's also like a big area. If you just look at it on the map, it needed to split in half just for, I guess, ruling's sake. Okay, so Georgia is our last colony. It was founded for two reasons. First, it's almost like a cushion between Spanish Florida and then the other English colonies to the north. it's almost like a borderland. They want to be able to keep the Spanish from moving into North America. Um, Also, it was a group of wealthy Englishmen led by a guy named James Oglethorpe. They wanted a colony where English debtors, so people who were in debt, they owed someone money, they wanted them to be able to come to Georgia and start over. So, under English law, people, if you could not pay your debts, you were imprisoned. Now, that doesn't make much sense because if you're in jail, you cannot earn money to pay your debt. But that was kind of how it was. He wanted debtors to James Oglethorpe wanted debtors to be able to come to Georgia and have some measure of peace and be able to start their life over. Oglethorpe was against slavery. He was actually a pretty good person. The founders of Georgia wanted Georgia to be a colony of small farms, not large plantations. Initially, again, because James Oglethorpe was against slavery, slavery was banned. But, as most things happen, um, people with less than noble uh, motives won out, and by the 1750s, slavery had become legal in Georgia. So, people along the coastline of the southern colonies, their lives are very different from people living towards the interior. Remember, the coastline is what we call the tidewater, and the interior is called the Piedmont. Um, the Tidewater region is very much what we think of stereotypically as a southern plantation. You have this large farm, and you have crops that are being grown there, like cotton and sugar and rice. Um, the economy is dominated by plantations in the Tidewater region. The plantation system starts in Virginia and Maryland, and it just moves south when they realize that there are other crops that can grow there for exportation to make a lot of money. The Tidewater region in South Carolina and Georgia is really, really well suited for growing rice, and rice requires a lot of labor. So, this is why rice farms end up helping to spread slavery. When people want to make more money, they will do that at the expense of just about everything. Eventually, the enslaved population of South Carolina outnumbers the free population. The plantation system didn't just um, it didn't just stratify society so that you have a society of slaveholders and then a group of enslaved people. You also have a very small community of white people that are wealthy, and then another group of it's like more people, more white people that have little or no property. So the class differences between the non-enslaved people in the South, it was pretty stark even before we would think about even just independence at all. So yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say about that part. Okay, so the backcountry, like I said, called the Piedmont, it was cut off from the coast. There were basically no roads. If there was a road, it was really bad. And it's got a lot, it's far away from any kind of real connection with large cities. Many of the families that lived on these isolated farms in the Piedmont didn't own the land that they farmed. They kind of just showed up and started farming. Many did not. Many lived in one-room shacks, and very few families had servants or enslaved people to help them with their work. The women and the girls worked in the fields with men and boys. Um, this is the stereotypical small, poor farmer in the South. if they had a slave, maybe it was one, and at this point, I don't want to say the slave was treated better because obviously they're not free, but they're treated similarly to people in their own family. When everyone is very close to starvation, you don't really have room to treat one person different from the other. But they mostly did not have, they mostly just didn't, they couldn't afford enslaved people. So in the backcountry, we have people less concerned with rank, and they thought that these colonial governments just didn't care about them. They thought that the colonial governments only cared about protecting the wealth of the Tidewater plantation owners. And I mean, to a point, they were right. Like these people, they were barely making a living out of land. And the colonial governments were certainly more concerned with maintaining um, the situation of these plantation owners who were making so much more money than these small farmers on in the backcountry in the Piedmont.